So we're here again in Lewis Carroll country, and we're calling it that because this is the stretch of river where the story of Alice in Wonderland was first told by Lewis Carroll to three girls on a boat journey from down here to Godstow, which is somewhere up here. Okay, but I've got a story for you today, and it's I think it's a good story. You're going to enjoy it. So once upon a time there was a guy called Marcelino Sanz de Santuola, and he lived in Cantabria and owned some land, and on his land there were tenant farmers and people living there, and he asked them to look out for any interesting caves they might find or anything interesting. He was an amateur archaeologist, so he asked them to notify him of anything of interest in the area. So one of his people, who was called beautifully named Modesto Cubia, he was like a hunter, modern day hunter-gatherer. He found he became aware of some caves that were known in the community for quite a while, and he notified Santuola sometime between 1868 and 1872, and the dates are going to be important just because, well, you'll find out. So Santuola didn't act upon it immediately. He didn't go and check it out straight away. It wasn't until 1875 that he went to have a look, and he had a little rummage around, a bit of reconnaissance, maybe a little architectural dig, and he didn't really find that much of interest, and sort of went away about his business and carried on with his life. But he came back now in 1879, almost 10 years after he'd first been notified of it, and had another little look around and was busy doing his thing. And he brought his 9-year-old daughter with him, and she was trying to distract him and get his attention. And you can almost imagine the scene, like he's rummaging around doing archaeological things, and she's like, "Papa," and he's like, "I'm busy, estoy ocupado," and she's like, "Papa," and he's like, "Estoy trapeando, I'm working." But she was insistent, "Papito," and eventually he gets up from what he's doing, and you can imagine, if you're making a film of it, this would be the point at which the orchestra would strike up, because what he saw were some amazing cave paintings on the ceiling, which for some reason people had never thought to look at before. So at that point he realized very quickly, so the year is 1879 now, he'd seen the year before in the Exposition Universelle in Paris, the World Exhibition, examples of Paleolithic art, which were carvings in bones of like antlers or mammoth tusk, and he recognized the animals and the style of the art as being very similar to the work that the paintings that he was seeing on the ceiling. So he made a connection there. So he thought, these could be by the same people. And the following year he wrote a paper, an understated paper, about his theory, and presented it to the world. Now he also made friends with a professor called Juan Villanova y Piera from the University of Madrid, who took his findings to, just get off the bridge for these people, took his findings to Lisbon, to what they called the Prehistoric Congress in 1880. So it was widely ridiculed at this Congress and just rubbished, and there was all kinds of theories as to why it was rubbish that were brought out. But what the problems they were facing were that the caves had been found in Spain, and the guys who'd found it was Spanish, and they wouldn't. And Santuola was not a professor or an academic, so his theory was like considered lesser. And this was because most of the findings were found in France. Most of the caves at that time, which were accepted as Paleolithic caves, were found in France. Most of the people studying it, or eminent people studying it, were Frenchmen. And they absolutely hammered him. And they said things like, it could be graffiti from Roman soldiers 2,000 years ago. They said that it could even be a modern forgery by a lesser follower of the modern school, because they had Impressionists and other kinds of avant-garde art around at the time. And they rubbished it. There was other theories, like, for example, they were on the ceiling, and how could they have lit it? Like, they would have had to use wooden burning torches, and there was no marks of any kind of that sort. So they just really discredited him and said that it was a fraud. He was trying to make his name and make some money. But having said that, even though he wrote his paper in 1880, King Alfonso the 12th of Spain came to see it. So there was a certain amount of prestige and fame came to the caves, and that also inspired a little bit of jealousy amongst the French academics. So he was basically under a fire left, right and centre, and his grandson said that the French academics vilified him and made his life one of sort of bitterness and rancor, not from him but towards him. And so eventually Santuola dies broken-hearted in 1888. But before that happened, there was a fella called a Frenchman called Émile de Cartiac, and he was one of the few people. They'd even refused to visit the cave. They were that sort of adamant in their beliefs. They wouldn't even go and look at it. So they were making all these pronouncements without even examining the cave itself. But this guy, Émile de Cartiac, he went to have a look, checked out the cave, and wrote a seminal book on the subject of upper these kind of caves and upper Paleolithic discoveries. And he mentions the cave, and he mentions all the sort of harpoons and needles and various little tools they found in the cave and in other places, but he never once mentioned the paintings. So it was completely overlooked. Now this guy Cartiac was kind of a leading figure in the academic thought in the academic world in this sphere, and he continued to rubbish it until 1897. All right, but what was happening in the meantime is that because this discovery had been made, people were re-examining other caves. So other caves where they'd made finds in the ground and they'd made digs, they suddenly realized that they might want to look at the ceilings, and they were finding paintings all over the place. So the school of thought started to shift. So we got to remember that he was first notified about the cave in 1868, somewhere between 1868 and 72, and in 1897 people are still rubbishing it, even though the paradigm is completely shifting. The cave paintings are being found everywhere. Like all the caves that were accepted as genuine prehistoric finds were now being found to have these cave paintings as well. So there was a massive shift occurring. And it became even more kind of difficult to dismiss these paintings as a forgery when there were other paintings of a similar type substantiating the ones in Cantabria where Santuola had found them. So in 1897, Cartiac is still rubbishing it, but by 1902 he's forced to write what was called mea culpa d'un sceptique, like the guilt of a skeptic, and he completely did a volte-face as a Frenchman. He turned his face right round and brought it back so that he accepted Santuola's findings. Now Santuola was dead and gone and had been vilified and broken almost by the attacks he'd come under. And this guy Cartiac is now. But not only does Cartiac make the concession that Santuola's findings were correct, but he completely takes charge of the narrative and becomes one of the leading fourth father figures of the movement. So there's kind of like a thread of moral tales running through this, like in the sense when I hear that about Cartiac becoming the prominent figure in the movement, it reminds me of like maybe a state that might assassinate a president or a civil rights leader and then make a airport named after them or have a day's holiday named after them. They completely absorb the historic event into their own narrative. Now what was actually the case was that Santuola's paper that he wrote in 1880 was the first paper ever written. It was a seminal work about prehistoric cave paintings. It'd never been done before, and yet what he met with was widespread criticism and condemnation. And the other thing we'd like to know, probably, because I'm always interested in things, what happened to Maria? Maria was actually the one who cottoned on, and also through the eyes of a child, she managed to make that paradigm shift that you should look up at the ceilings. Maria grew up to marry someone wealthy or a well-off family, and their children, Santuola's descendants, strangely enough, are now the people who run the powerful Santander Bank. It almost ruins the story for me that they're now bankers. But there's plenty of moral tales running through that. I'm not even going to go into them because we've got this whole pandemic scenario in the backdrop here, but there's certain things that we might want to look at, like unquestioning belief in authority, the way that the academia rallies round to crush new thought, the way that thought cannot come from, or information cannot come from anything other than a prescribed and predetermined source, and yet sometimes that information is sort of seminal and life-changing. And the other thing is that the paradigm that those academics had was that the prehistoric people were troglodytes and subhuman, and in their paradigm they could not accept that they could have made artworks that were of a standard that were comparable to works of the modern school. There's a professor called Professor Guinea from the University of Santander, and he says that that was the major problem. If they'd been terrible paintings, they would have accepted them. So again, personal incredulity is no foundation for the argument. Things can be much more impressive, or much more... The world is a stranger place. There are more things under heaven and earth, Horatio, than I dreamt of in your philosophy. Take care, plenty to think about.